Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Sorry about the mix-up with the slides, but I think you see me now, and so Katie is about to show the slides, and then going to have a very sort of quick overview of the rest of this presentation. Perfect, thanks, Kate. So just to recap, so we have this systematic review of low emission zone schemes and congestion charging schemes. The broad aim is look at these health impacts, both road traffic injuries and sort of this wide bucket of things that you might consider to be caused by air pollution, so cardiovascular diseases in their birth outcomes or in their lung cancer and diabetes. Crucially, we restricted to just longitudinal studies, so we didn't include only cross-sectional studies. And we also only included studies with empirically measured health data. And that's because some studies had predicted essentially what was going to happen to air pollution with the implementation of schemes and then fit as sort of a percentage reduction, say, in heart attacks. So we didn't include those studies just based on sort of predictions of what might happen. So can you go to the next slide, please? So in terms of what we find about 3,200 studies that filtered down to about 57 studies we looked at in full text. We kicked about 40 of those out to end up with 17 studies at the end. 2 of those studies were identified by searching the references of the initial 15 studies that we find. So can we go to the next slide? And so how it breaks down is shown really in this slide. So there's 9 studies looking at low emission zones. So these were predominant, most of these were in Germany, in the UK and Japan. And so these tended to look at these air quality related outcomes, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease. The congestion charging studies, there were 8 of those. And so those tended to be based in London on the London congestion charge, with 1 study in Sweden. And these very much focused on road traffic injuries. In terms of design of the studies, they were mainly difference in difference studies or interrupted time series studies. So really, really a focus on natural experimental designs in the studies used. Next slide, please. So this is, appreciate this is a little bit, there's quite a lot to take in these next few results slides. But so this is our harvest plot of what we found across this slide is low emission zones. So down the left hand side there, you've got the outcome, and each bar is a study and it has the reference number in there. The height of the study is the quality assessment, how good did we rate the study as being. And because different studies, so if you imagine a study looking at broadly at cardiovascular disease, it might have total cardiovascular disease, then it might have, say, hypertension, and it might have heart attacks. So different studies can be represented more than once here. So we tried to display what you get across the whole picture of outcomes. There's no increase in any of these outcomes post implementing low emission zones. And so if you look there at cardiovascular disease, reasonably convincing evidence, 5 studies that all say there's some type of reduction in cardiovascular disease post implementation, but also 2 studies across subgroups that find no real effects. So a bit of a variable picture, and you get a variable picture of some of the other outcomes. If you go to the next slide, please. And so the next slide gives a bit of a sense of the sort of size of effects we're looking at here. So you've got, 1 study found a -2% reduction in cardiovascular disease. There's a -5% reduction in hypertension. And so these are sort of the size of effects we're talking about. So they're modest, but they're not huge, but they're not completely insignificant. If you go to the next slide shows that across diabetes and a few other outcomes, we have sort of one or 2 individual studies. Again, there's nothing to suggest that these schemes are increasing health risks, but a bit of a variable picture. So the next slide shows what we have across congestion charging schemes. And so this slide again is a little bit messy because with the predominant focus on road traffic injuries, things are broken down by severity of injury and mode of travel. But again, it's a a positive picture in terms of, so 6 out of the 7 studies say a clear reduction in total injuries or injuries caused by car. But there is one study, one single study that finds an increase in cycling and motorcycling industry injuries after implementation of these schemes. And then to the next slide, which is the final result slide, shows again the sort of size of impacts we're looking at here, so between 2 and 7%, mainly in terms of reductions. But one study found a whopping 37% reduction in road traffic injuries just in the month after implementation. And so the next slide, please. So just in conclusion, so this work is still going on, but I would say, the evidence says low emission zones can reduce some health outcomes related to air pollution. The evidence around cardiovascular disease is stronger than for other outcomes, and we haven't looked at specifically what is causing this. So is it air pollution? Is it something else? We don't know. And the London congestion charging scheme has reduced overall car road traffic injuries, potentially some increases across different subcategories of mode, but we haven't quite got to the bottom of how we're gonna interpret that. But it looks like that is a sort of subgroup analysis, and the generalizability is that what would happen if we implemented this in other cities is still unclear. And so next slide, please. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks to SPHR for funding this, and thanks to the co-authors. And hopefully we're on time for any questions people have.